Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Ray. I'm a detransition male, and today I'm going to be talking about a very interesting Reddit thread I saw in Ask Transgender the other day. The title of the thread was something like, "Am I trans or is it just a fetish?" And if you search through, the history of that subreddit, you will find this is a very common question that gets asked a lot, and it sort of usually lays out a very similar story, and the answers are almost always the same. So the poster of that thread basically laid out a narrative that was textbook autogynephile. So if you don't know, autogynephilia is when you have a sexual attraction to the idea of oneself as a woman. And this idea of oneself as a woman can take on, various forms as in regards to, how it manifests. It can be, an interest in women's clothing. It can be, imagining having female anatomy, female physiology. It could, imagine, kind of the interpersonal dimension of being treated like a woman or having sex as if one was a woman with men, etc. So there's a lot of different dimensions, but the core idea is that you have a sort of heterosexual attraction to femininity, and then that gets inverted such that you're attracted to the manifestation of femininity in your own life, and this is connected to arousal, and it has a paraphilic dimension. So here we have this poster asking this question: am I trans or is it just a fetish? And then he gives a textbook, he, she, I don't know, the pronouns here for this poster, because they weren't quite identifying as trans yet, so, and they didn't request she, her pronouns. So out of, respect, I'm going to just keep using the he, him pronouns. So, but it's not like I'm, trying to intentionally misgender this person or anything like that. I do actually believe in honoring people's pronouns, just because, I think it's a polite thing to do. Anyway, so this person, he basically laid out a narrative where, he would try on women's clothing, and then he would get aroused, and then, he sort of enjoyed this. It felt good, but every time he started wearing women's clothing, he ended up masturbating, and then as soon as he had, post-nut clarity, he wanted nothing to do with, being a woman or femininity, and he just wanted to revert to basically being a normal guy. But, when he was, in the heat of the moment, whatever, he sort of had all these fantasies, about being a woman, wanting to live a life as a woman, get married as a woman, have relationships as a woman, be a mother, kind of like a very elaborate fantasy life about, living out this female persona, or whatever. But, so he had this elaborate fantasy life that wasn't necessarily entirely sexual, but nevertheless, when he engaged in this fantasy life, it eventually led him down the path of cross-dressing, which led to masturbation, which led to post-nut clarity, which then, instantly, as soon as, the post-nut clarity happened, then, all those desires would vanish, and he would, basically revert back to, I just want to be a regular, stereotypical man. And so if you know anything about autogynephilia, this is like textbook. This is like, basically the exact narrative case that the concept or the construct was used to characterize. So this is textbook. Now, what I want to talk about is the sort of responses to this thread. That most upvoted comment was basically saying, while it may be possible this is just a fetish, there's something going on here, because no cis man would ever think these thoughts. Like, cis men don't have these crises, and that's kind of like a theme in the rest of the comments as well, where people would basically say, if you're having these doubts, then that means that you are trans. Cis people don't have these sorts of doubts. They don't go through this kind of crisis, that they don't experience these feelings. And, it's sort of like this circular logic where, if you do have doubts about your gender, or you have cross-gender fantasy, then, you're automatically considered to be trans because cis people don't have these fantasies. And there's not really like evidence to support this. It just kind of is a commonly repeated thing because, so many commenters were basically saying, this is common, this happens all the time, I fully resonate, this is how it started with me. And they would call these euphoria boners, where, these sort of, the arousal component is just, you're just feeling good in your gender, and this is like normal. And, autogynephilia as a theory has been completely debunked, and this like in no way invalidates your transness, and this is just like a common thing to do. But, the thing I want to narrow in on here is the idea that no cis man has these thoughts. Well, let me just tell you my own personal story. I consider myself to have autogynephilia, and I actually totally resonate with this narrative because that was me. And, but I kind of bought into this idea that, these things prove that I'm trans because it is a common narrative among trans women. So if it's a common narrative with trans women, then, having this history of, these cross-gender fantasies connected to arousal and masturbation or whatever, that in no way invalidates one's transness, because there's all these trans women who are relating to this story and saying this is a normal thing to experience if you are a trans woman. And I want to clarify that, the type of trans women who resonate with this story are almost exclusively, attracted to, women, or they're bisexual. But, the trans women who are exclusively attracted to men generally don't resonate with this type of narrative whatsoever. So that's sort of, one additional piece of clarification, which ties into the entire theory behind, autogynephilia. But nevertheless, when I 8 years ago, when I transitioned, I bought into this idea because I was doing this similar research on Reddit, sort of, trying to confirm that my, history of cross-gender arousal and fantasy, basically, I didn't think about it at the time in these terms, but I had an autogynephilic, life history, and these desires have been with me since I was very young. And, I had an interest in women's clothing, a particular narrow interest in a particular type of women's clothing, since before I even hit puberty. And then, puberty sort of like accelerated these fantasies, and then they kind of got stronger and stronger as I went through my teenage years into my 20s, until finally, the dam burst, and, I took on this trans identity because I, did research that confirmed that having a trans identity is compatible with this life history, because everyone said that if you have these thoughts and desires, you must be trans, because, normal cis men don't have these fantasies. They don't have this crisis. They're not sitting there questioning, like, am I, a man, or like they're not asking, like, am I a man with a fetish, or am I really trans? Like, this idea is repeated over and over and over, that cis men don't think about this stuff. And that's the thing I want to challenge in this video, is that sort of, dichotomy between cisgender and transgender, because I don't think it's necessarily super useful because, now that I've detransitioned, a lot of people, might say, well, I'm just a cisgender man who, mistakenly thought I was trans and spent 8 years on hormones taking on a female persona and thinking that I'm trans. Well, I exactly resonate with this poster's life story. And, I very much had this crisis. I very much had these doubts. And, so to say that cis people don't think about this is not really true, because there are plenty of cis men, aka men who don't explicitly, have a trans identity. They think about this stuff. They have these crises, and it's just that sometimes the crisis, if you fall into a certain ideological community where people are telling you that, like, hey, the best way to interpret your experiences is by adopting this identity of being trans, and they use your experiences to see, as like proof that you're trans, and the proof that you're trans is because other people who have adopted a trans identity relate to that experience. And so but it's not like, it doesn't follow like you don't have to have a trans identity to resonate with this life story. For example, right now, I don't have a trans identity. I've detransitioned, basically meaning I've rejected the trans label for myself. I don't use the trans label to describe, what my life is like, or what my identity is. But nevertheless, I precisely resonate with this life story. So I am at least one counterexample of someone who, has these feelings, has these desires, went through that doubt, went through that crisis. But, currently, I don't feel it's necessary to have a trans identity in order to reconcile myself to the truth of the fact that I have these desires, because this autogynephilic, cross-gender arousal fantasy stuff, it's still with me. I still have it. Like, it never went away. It's just that I realized that I don't have to take on a trans identity in order to integrate these desires into my social life. I can identify as a male person and be happy in my male body with a male identity, and integrate these desires in a way that doesn't require me to take on this trans feminine identity, even though, if I, somehow erased my knowledge about all this and just went on Reddit and described my experiences in regards to these cross-gender fantasies, I could very much, ask an identical question, am I trans, or is it a fetish, and sort of lay out an exactly similar story. And all these people would say, oh, the fact that you're doubting this is proof that you're trans. Cis people don't doubt this, stuff like cis people don't think like this. And this is why I think the cis trans distinction is not super helpful here, because it's not really getting at the heart of the issue in regards to what is the causative factor of these thoughts and feelings and this arousal pattern, which has a very particular, psychological pattern, in terms of you put on the clothing, and then you get aroused, and you masturbate, then you get clarity, and you sort of doubt, and you go through these purging cycles where you sort of you purge all the thoughts, you just try and be a man, and then, the arousal comes back, so you go through the cycle again, and then eventually the cycles get tighter and tighter, and so that eventually you're sort of wrapped up in this all the time, and this sort of these desires and attraction to being, feminine kind of take over, and they sort of persist throughout your whole life. And then you go on Reddit and you type in your story and you confirm that hey, this, makes me trans. Then you take on a trans identity, and then, sort of start worrying about passing. Well, it's like, oh, well, now I'm like, have these desires and I want to be a woman, so I need to pass. So, I gotta, take these, different interventions medically in order to facilitate that. And I'm not necessarily making a statement in regards to whether these, further interventions or transition or whatever is like, good or bad as like a treatment modality for dealing with these desires, because, the literature suggests that, sometimes these autogynephilic fantasies can take on a degree of severity such that they interfere with your life functioning, and you sort of get obsessive about it, and it kind of takes over your life, and you're not able to integrate them into your life in a way that facilitates like normal social functioning or normal psychological well-being. And you can kind of have psychological distress, and sometimes if the degree of severity is intense enough, transition can be a way to alleviate that distress in a way that leads to greater psychosocial functioning. And this has been proven over and over again in terms of that. But I think all those questions about what is the right clinical treatment for people who have severe instantiations of this phenomenon, like, is an entirely separate question of like whether the additional identity of taking on the trans label to describe yourself, that's incidental, because the decision to take on that trans label is a choice, more or less, in terms of like, you sort of have this experience, you have these desires, but how you describe yourself in regards to the label you put on yourself in terms of your identity, like that is more or less a choice. And often this choice in terms of what label to stick on yourself to describe yourself and to describe your experiences, this is influenced by our social environment in terms of like what are the labels and identities that we are exposed to when we talk to our friends in our communities. Like if you're heavily involved in the LGBT community, and you're on like trans Reddit, reading Ask Transgender, and watching ContraPoints and like all this like trans stuff, and you're just like super absorbed in like talking to trans women, hanging out with trans women, you're in trans discords, you're on trans Reddit, you're looking on trans Twitter, you're on trans memes, like yeah, of course you're gonna like interpret your experiences in terms of the trans narrative. But what I'm trying to get at is like that decision to take on this trans identity is a choice. Now, I'm not saying it's like a bad choice. What I'm trying to point out is that it is a choice, and maybe the choice is to some extent unconscious because of these social influences are often like so strong that we don't really recognize the fact that we're being exposed to a particular like linguistic framework and vocabulary in order to describe our experiences. But there are like alternative ways to describe one's own identity that don't necessarily involve like taking on that like trans identity. And you can not have a trans identity but nevertheless still feel like transition and all this stuff is like the right course of action. And then you can sort of like redefine what it means to be trans, not in terms of like identity, but but in terms of like what are the concrete actions you take in order to alleviate the psychosocial distress that involves having these desires and stuff. So the transness is not an identity per se, but a description of the fact that you took a certain treatment modality, a certain pathway in order to deal with these desires. So the transness becomes a description of concrete actions that you're taking in order to alleviate your psychosocial suffering, and not a description of some inner identity. Because if you analyze the causal etiology of where these desires come from, they are tied into this autogynephilic causal pathway, which if you study that, it has to do with an inversion of an erotic target, or at least that's the best theory in regards to like where this all comes from. It's like it has to do with like a sexual orientation that's inverted in some way, and that's like the true causative factor behind these desires. And like having a better understanding of the actual causation neuroscientifically, neurologically, in terms of like what's causing all this and these sort of like social environmental factors that influence, the way in which this inversion of erotic target location gets manifested, via our exposure to different social environments, different linguistic constructs and all this stuff, different communities. Depending on what community we're in, we might have the exact same experience but interpret it in very different ways. So that's all I'm trying to get at here. I'm not necessarily make any like judgments about what's like the best way to describe yourself. No, I'm not trying to judge anyone here. I'm just sort of saying that like these psychosocial factors in terms of like how like when we have these desires, get expressed through the context of our interactions with linguistic communities that have certain labels that are used to describe the very same experiences. And it's not like a necessary entailment that you have these desires that you must thereby take on the trans label, because that is a choice and there are alternative ways to describe yourself. So that's all I'm getting at, is that there are alternative ways to integrate these desires into your psychosocial identity. So hopefully all that made sense. Thanks for listening. Take care.